I predict a Halloween special. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of Real History. I am history professor Jared Frederick, so glad to have you join us once again. For something a little bit seasonal here, we are going to take a look at a horror movie, believe it or not, and that is the 2015 film by director Robert Eggers, and that is The Witch. And I really enjoy this film. And what makes it so appealing in my mind is that it's a perfect mixture of historical authenticity, suspense, and horror. Because after all, colonial America was a very horrific and dark place. And it was also a rather supernatural setting as well, as people of the time believed. That is how they tried to make sense of these natural phenomena that often took place around them. And so there's a lot to consider in this film, and we're going to go ahead and take a look at it right now. So let's go ahead and go down that dark path and take a look at The Witch.
We travailed a vast ocean. For what?
We must ask thee to be silent.
Was it not for the pure and faithful dispensation of the Gospels?
Right off the bat, we're introduced to a number of key historical factors. One, we get a sense that the individuals within this New England colony are in fact immigrants. They have traversed the oceans. They have given up considerable blood, sweat, and tears in order to get here. Another factor is that the historical clothing, the costuming in this movie is spot on. This is one of the best representations of costumes regarding colonial America that I have ever seen. So the filmmakers really did their homework in this regard. The other thing to take into account in this sort of a tribunal setting is that the so-called pilgrims, the separatists, the Puritans, what have you, and there are different categorizations of all those individuals, and they kind of blend into one through historical memory. We often think of them, though, as these forward-thinking individuals who believed in religious freedom, and that is why they came to North America in the first place. And that is really not a full picture, and it kind of fails in presenting the complexity of the time. Because in Puritan New England, things were often really, really harsh. If you didn't adhere to these strict religious guidelines, if you spoke out of turn, if you defied authority, if you defied the church, indeed, you could be banished. And some of the activities that I have my students look at in the classroom when we look at colonial New England is that I have them look at Plymouth Colony court records. And, you know, we see people involved in various infidelities, theft, all sort of sexual misconduct, and it just goes to show that they were human beings as culpable and as likely to sin and temptation and everything that people in the modern era are. And so it was not this perfect storybook environment as how we are often presented in grade school. It was very complex. It had the capacity to be very harsh, vindictive, draconian. And if you stepped out of line, you could be banished, as we see here with the family right out of the gate. Another one of the aspects of this film that I really enjoy is that the setting itself seems to be a villain, that there's this omniscient presence that is located here. And this was something that was most definitely felt and observed among colonial settlers who were moving into these borderland areas, what they consider to be on the periphery of civilization. And yeah, one of the strengths of this movie is that it imparts this idea of isolation. That you're out there on your own. You could be miles away from your nearest neighbor. And throughout the course of the movie, we see that heightened sense of isolation turn into desperation and suspicion. And it's not at all out of the realm of possibility that you see these sort of vindictive turns among family members and neighbors as they essentially have cabin fever.
Sam? Samuel!
What the movie plays on here is this paranoia, this sense of thought about what could be lingering in the woods. And as I mentioned, these settlers who were living in New England, they believed in witchcraft. They believed in, the realm of sorcery. And they abided by those sorts of beliefs to make rationalizations about the things that happened around them. And so, one of the big questions of this movie is this something that is really playing out amongst the characters? Is it something they are imagining? And those are some of the mind games that we see playing throughout. The idea of a witch, kind of her bathing herself in blood, using it as an ointment. This is something that would be found in Old English texts. And supposedly, it was a sort of ointment that would be able to make a witch look younger, to give her special powers, or to be able to make her fly. And so this is the rationale for showing as grisly a scene as this is. A really excellent little read that chronicles the colonial existence and lifestyles is this book right here, Everyday Life in Early America by historian David Freeman Hawke. And why this is so valuable is that it not only gets into practices of agriculture, building homes, cooking, the family structure, so on and so forth, but it gets into these notions of superstition and the supernatural, and how these farmers, perceived the world in which they lived. And so this one excerpt really kind of gets to the point. Everyone could debate the meaning of providential signs, but superstitions carried clear mandates not to be contravened. A black cat crossing one's path was an omen of bad luck. But the same cat's blood had medicinal value. Hence, in some settlements, quote, there was scarcely a black cat whose ears and tail had not frequently been cropped for a contribution of blood. To break a mirror also assured bad luck in the near future, and for some it forecast an early death in the family. Every ethnic group brought its own set of superstitions from home. So here we see, we see these patterns among these different colonial enclaves, and they varied by religion, ethnic background, and regions within the American colonies. One of the other things that colonial settlers sometimes did is they did something called moon watching. And Hawke has some input on this as well. And he said, a sampling of the lore handed down throughout the century reveals that pole beans should be planted when the horns of the moon are up to encourage them to climb. But a farmer must not roof a building then, for the shingles will warp upward. He should plant root crops during the dark of the moon, but not pick apples, which will rot regardless how they are stored. For their admonitions held that during a new moon a farmer should sow herbs, garlic, radishes, and hay in his meadows, but beware that setting a goose will produce blinded goslings. And so you see all of these different elements that are being taken into consideration among individuals and farmers as such. And, it leads us to question the logic of how and why they did these things today. But, in many regards, some of these traditions still exist in corners of North America.
And if I died this day,
What is this?
I ought evil in my heart. My sins are not pardoned.
Thou art young yet.
And if God will not hear my prayer.
Caleb.
Tell me.
In these conversations that we have with the father and the son as they are hunting in the woods, there are hints of these points of predestination. And Puritanism is grounded in this Calvinist belief of predestination that, that we aren't necessarily born with a clean slate. We as individuals do not have tabula rasa, as the old saying goes. That God has a defined purpose for us, and it is He who will determine whether or not we go to heaven or we are damned to hell. And so there are all these conversations that come up about the young baby Samuel here. Was he one of God's chosen children? Is it a mere form of fate, or is it God's will that he was taken away from his family as such? And undoubtedly, had a child gone missing, in colonial New England as such, these very well may have been the conversations that the parents and family members would have had.
Oh, fine, let's other end.
The weapon that we see being used here is a matchlock musket, very typical of the type of weaponry that Europeans would have had in 17th century North America. And essentially how it works is that you have a match or a slowly burning fuse that will ignite the powder in the pan. And so it is a very rudimentary form of the sort of more technologically advanced musketry that we will see in the 18th century and the 19th century. So it's definitely another good material culture standpoint that we see being represented here.
Newton, stop that!
The animal character here of Black Phillip kind of becomes iconic to this film. You know, he's featured on the poster. He shows up repetitively in the film. And we shouldn't be at all surprised about this, because there was this belief in some corners of 17th century America that the devil or some satanic force could materialize in the form of an animal, whether it be a black goat, a black cat, a black rat. The list goes on and on. Ravens, etc., etc. And now and again throughout the film, these are creatures that are interwoven in and out of the storyline. And so here too, we are taking elements of myth and folklore, infusing it into this cinematic blend, and it's quite creepy as an end result. When I ask my students what they think the most prized commodity was in regard to natural resources in colonial America, they have a wide range of guesses. Sometimes they guess certain types of crops. Certainly water is very important, but one of the most lucrative and most significant is timber. Because if you think about the number of things that you can do with timber, it's not only a form of fuel, you use it as a form of transportation if you want to make a dugout canoe, a boat, something along those lines, and of course you need it for accommodation, for shelter as well. And so it was very, very grueling though, because of course after you chop the wood, you have to let it dry for an extended period of time in order for you to be able to use it and burn it as fuel. And so the first year of settlers living in these types of environments was especially grueling, because they did not have any dry wood in mass quantity for the most parts. And so trying to burn wet wood during a harsh New England fall and winter, these were very belaboring and pressing times for individuals in such circumstances.
It was a witch. No. It was a witch, Mercy. You speak aright.
Thomason!
It was I.
And of course, as we see 60-some years later in regard to the Salem witch trials, it's this sort of playful banter among children where they are, joking about being witches or possessing their family members or friends that will get them in hot water, because when mysterious circumstances begin to appear, people begin to think and they begin to ponder back and like, oh yeah, my sister, my neighbor, my mother, they said that they were a witch of the wood or something like that. And then that sort of playfulness and joking around ends up becoming ammunition that former neighbors and loved ones will then use against each other.
We beseech thee, increase our faith in the promise of the gospel, our fear of thy name, and the hatred of all our sins, that we may be assured that...
Another aspect of The Witch that I appreciate as a historian is that, you know, many filmmakers would have chosen to take the cheap and easy way out, and they would have modified and modernized the English being used throughout the motion picture. But to his credit, Robert Eggers really stayed true to form, and he used this very authentically cast old-time language that you can find in abundant ways in the historical documentation of the time. And so, you know, if you want a good depiction of how Puritans of the 17th century talked, how they interacted, how they prayed, the manner in which they saw their connection to a higher being and God and whatnot. There are few finer representations than what we see in this film.
Thomason, what's that doing with the silver cup?
Just on the shelf.
No.
Throughout the film, the mother's preoccupation with her family silver that has been sold off by the husband speaks in a thematic sort of way as to how the family is fracturing, how they are in some ways breaking away from what is a pure Puritanism. The Puritans were very much against the ideas of materialism, idolatry, attachment to material objects, and so the mother's, frenzy about her cup going missing, and the accusatory nature in which she talks about it with her family members, suggests that she is falling away. She's going down the wayward path, so to speak, from a spiritual perspective.
How thou could lose me father's silver wine cup in this hovel, I cannot know.
Haven't told.
Peace, child. He's gone.
These conversations about family throughout are quite revealing. And, with our modern sensibilities today, we tend to look at the individual as the basic component of society. But if you were alive 300 plus years ago, it was family that was the basic unit of society. Family was everything. You worked for your family. You bought land for your family. The reason that you had children is so that your family could live on, so that you could have a namesake, so that you could have a legacy. And so your entire life is structured around the loved ones who lived and worked with you. Everything that you did was about them. And so you get a strong sense of this in this film. And the parents, as they're talking here, they feel blessed that they had not lost a child up until this point. Which in some cases would have been a rarity in colonial America because there was such a high number of babies who died in childbirth or shortly thereafter. And likewise, there was a high proportion of mothers who died as well, often during childbirth. And therefore, it was often not uncommon for there to be many a widower in colonial America, who sometimes would marry on multiple occasions.
I'll to the village with the horse and Thomason tomorrow. The tidings or the whitings, they can make use of her.
With this talk of Thomason being sent away, once again we're exposed to this idea that the family is disintegrating. That they are falling apart, that they are being separated either by death or economic circumstances. And of course, this just further plays into that heightened suspension that the family is already starting to turn on each other, or that there's a lack of trust. And that will only have more fuel poured on it as the story progresses.
Well? But we did.
Nay.
We did.
No.
Beyond tales of witchcraft, this movie simply excels in demonstrating the hardship of colonial life. That your abilities to sustain yourself is dependent upon a crop which may fail. It depends upon traps that are set in the woods that might not catch any animals. It depends on firearms, which may misfire, as they do in this movie. And all of these things just contribute to that ongoing sense of anxiety that we see throughout. You know, in most of the movie, we don't see the witch, although there's this sense that there's a presence of evil. And I think that that is very fitting because you know, sometimes, you know, evil is perceived as being that of the unknown. And for so many of these folks, their whole life was a question mark. Their whole life was a matter of the unknown because they didn't know what would happen next.
Thomason! Caleb! Thomason! Thomason! Caleb! Caleb!
Gotta love the 17th century daycare. Tie the kids to a fence post. Yeah, this idea of an 11-year-old kid getting lost in the woods, you know, separated from a family member, separated from the family dog, there's a sense of haunting bewilderment to it. And without even any of the supernatural elements, getting lost in the woods when you're walking through this deep, dark, howling wilderness, in many ways is scary enough as it is. And of course, the idea of seduction plays an integral part in this story, and it is very much connected with that idea of isolation. The young son, he's not near, any women his own age. He kind of gives these glares at his sister, and then here, right before he starts to meet his fate, he's confronted by this, gorgeous, bewitching character who lives in this kind of mystical cabin out in the woods. And so, as we will perhaps see later in the film, evil sometimes manifests itself in these rather seductive and appealing ways. And indeed, that's how many people viewed the appeal of sin back in the 17th century.
Just remember John Kemp's son. That first winter he was tormented of Indian magic.
This is not the same.
This is unnatural providence.
Other elements of this movie that are quite telling have to do with both gender and youth, which were often major themes that became very much apparent as people were discussing and making accusations of witchcraft at this time. And I'll share with you a brief snippet from a Time article that was written in reaction to this film. And it said, most people believed to be witches at the time were women, though not because gender was part of the definition of a witch. A part of the reason, as historian Elizabeth Rice has written, was physical. Puritans believed that the devil had an easier time gaining access to women's physically weaker bodies. But perhaps more importantly, there were social reasons for women to be more frequently accused. The stereotypes of the time held that women were predisposed to sin. They were seen as more sexual, more tempted by material goods, and more in need of guiding authority, specifically in the form of the church or a father or a husband, Howe says. And so these themes are so readily apparent in The Witch, and they become more and more evident as the narrative begins to spiral out of control for the unfortunate family depicted therein.
Look at the narrow eyes I could have had.
The director claims that many of these instances, these moments, in this case in which the son is being possessed and is in the fight for his life to try to dispel the demons within him, is based off of real-life testimony, of eyewitness accounts of people who claim to see these things unfolding in colonial New England. And it just makes it all the more eerie and intense as a result. The fact that many of these stories are purportedly derived from the historical record of what people claimed and believed to be true.
What is...
And here once again we see the apple, the symbol of temptation.
Dr. Blood, she had kept secret from you!
But just to quiet her.
She came back and we Satan! Sign his book!
Silence!
Don't let her near me! She'll place a curse on me!
And this is where this fooling around and joking from earlier ultimately comes back to haunt her, which very well may have been the case years later in regard to the Salem witch trials.
And lead us in the path of righteousness, for his name's sake. For yea, though I should walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me.
The practice of performing exorcisms was not entirely an alien concept to the Puritans of this time. And exorcisms, or strong, soulful prayer like we see here, it could be applied in a number of different ways. One way in which the Puritans often tried to conduct exorcism was through fasting. You know, it was the idea of cleansing and clearing one's body and soul, and there was the belief that that could achieve the desired effect. But of course, here for the poor son, as is fictitiously depicted in the film, it's too little too late, that his soul is cleansed through prayer at the very end, but it's not enough to overcome the evil that has consumed him. And it's certainly one of the more intense moments of the movie where you're really kind of on the edge of your seat.
They know well his voice.
Got to.
The adversary oft comes in the shape of a he-goat and whispers, aye, whispers.
As the plot thickens here, you know, one of the beliefs at the time is that witches could depart a body that they inhabited, and that their spirits could roam around to carry on their evil as they will, and then they could inhabit other human beings or other creatures. And so what we see here among the characters as they continue on this downward trajectory is that they don't know who to trust. They don't know who to believe. They don't know what they can trust. And, you know, man, it's just so intense as a result. It works really well as a theatrical device. The idea of people turning on each other.
If that old Billy be the devil, I'd have danced with him myself. I'll break the out upon the door, and we'll set back to the plantation.
And I'll make another interesting note here about the appearance and the structure of the farm itself, because these farmsteads looked dramatically different in comparison to what they would look like a century later often. Frequently in the 1600s, these homesteads would consist of thatched roofs. They would have these kind of slapboard walls that were essentially pasted together with clay. And, you know, this is how they looked. And we see a perfect depiction here. I mean, this is a spot-on recreation of what these farms actually looked like. So once again, the production designers just really did some phenomenal homework here. During this time, women ran their own households. You know, life out here in colonial America, it was really the essence of partnership. Men had their duties and women had their duties, and they were equally important in order to operate a functioning household and farmstead. Their very survival depended upon it. But with this fatherly plea that we see here, this beseeching on the part of the dad, You know, we see his kind of patriarchal obligations coming to suit here, that can I be a man if I have failed my family? I have failed to protect them. I have failed to safeguard them from this evil that is all around us. And it's just such a telling moment here in how people saw themselves in their worlds and how they saw and were to interact and also guard their family members in trying circumstances. And on the background there, we saw that the silver cup that has returned. And of course, Judas betrayed Christ for 30 pieces of silver. So there's some symbolism here. And then, of course, the apparition of Caleb likewise returns with that of Samuel. And the mother, as a result, makes this descent into darkness in order to reconnect with her children who have been taken away from her. So spooky. And of course, too, you know, imagery of, you know, a raven or a crow. Once again, an animal in black, a portender of evil or ominous things. Man. Black Phillip has the last laugh.
Corruption. Thou art my father.
And here, you know, this certainly symbolizes, you know, the house falling down upon the father. Yet another kind of symbolic action here in the final moments of the film. It's very drab yet compelling cinematography that we can see here. And as our producer, Andrew, just very smartly mentioned, you know, the only color that really pops is the red of blood. Not only symbolizing sin, but of course also red is the color of seduction as well. And so that is kind of constantly always taunting and enveloping the characters here.
Wouldst thou like to live deliciously? I will guide thy hand.
And of course, here at the end of the movie, as we are introduced to the devil in the flesh, he does not have scales, he does not have horns, he is not red, but rather he's this rather handsome guy who is dressed as a cavalier might during the English Civil War of this era. And he's asking her, you know, what's thou like to live deliciously, and so on and so forth. And that just circles back to this idea of lust and temptation. That is such a powerful and recurring historical theme that we see here that motivates so many of our characters throughout the film.
Dost thou see a book before thee?
And as you look at these old texts, you know, you can think of, you know, nakedness as being part of the ritual. That is, you know, included, you know, ideas of paganism, witchcraft, sorcery, so on and so forth. And of course, it goes back to the idea of the original sin and the nakedness in the Garden of Eden as well. And so, you know, here too, perhaps we should not be at all surprised that we conclude with this sort of nude ritual that is happening here in the wilderness. And I love this little bit of coda here, that much of the dialogue comes directly from these period sources. And so these are the sort of rich primary sources that I like to see historians dig out. And of course, you know, perhaps there were explanations as to, you know, what possessed people in the manner that they did. But, you know, it just goes to show that sometimes, you know, I think of this in the realm of like historical ghost stories or ghost tours, is that real history, pun intended there, often it doesn't need to be embellished. It doesn't really need to be exaggerated, because sometimes the real history in and of itself can be horrific and haunting enough. And I think that's one of the great lessons from this story when we think about ghost stories that occur within a historical context. But hold on just 1 minute. Don't go away quite yet, because there's another trick-or-treat, or shall we say Easter egg, to be found within this film. Throughout the movie, we see that the family is struggling with crops, and the failure of those crops is possibly due to the ergot fungus, which was very prolific in New England at this time. And there's an interesting story behind the whole problem of ergot, and the University of Houston, in an article, has this to say on the matter. In 1976, Linda Corporell offered the first evidence that the Salem witch trials followed an outbreak of the rye ergot. Ergot is a fungus blight that forms hallucinogenic drugs in bread. Its victims can appear bewitched when they're actually stoned. Ergot thrives in a cold winter followed by a wet spring. The victims of ergot might suffer paranoia and hallucinations, twitches and spasms, cardiovascular trouble, and stillborn children. Ergot also seriously weakens the immune system. And so here at the end of the film, it begs the question, was this family really bewitched, or were they hallucinating it all? Were they imagining all of this evil that was around them? And was it really themselves that were the true enemy and the true evil within? Something to think about. As we always do here on Real History, I like to recommend some books. And one book that I pointed out earlier is Everyday Life in Early America by David Freeman Hawke. This is a very concise book that gets into the ins and outs of colonial life in the various regions in which English settlers were inhabiting North America. And it's a very digestible and accessible and compelling story of what people during this time period often had to confront. The other book that I would like to suggest is Six Women of Salem by Mary Lynn Roach. And this is, in my mind, one of the best books about the Salem witch trials, about the cultural and religious conditions that led to this persecution of innocent people that ultimately led to the executions of 20 of them. And there's a lot of really rich scholarship on the Salem witch trials. And in short, you know, it was a lot of pre-existing political and economic circumstances that ultimately led to these neighbors turning against each other. And they only needed that little bit of extra fuel to pour on the fire in regard to the supernatural that let them embark on their so-called witch hunt. But all things considered, something like the Salem witch hunt is more of an anomaly in the context of colonial history. Very rarely were there large numbers of so-called witches who were accused or persecuted at any one time. Whenever somebody, in most cases a young woman, was accused, it often played out more in the realm like we see in The Witch. It usually involved one or two people, and these sorts of conversations and accusations were unfolding in a smaller, kind of more organic ways, I think that we could argue. So these are all of the things that I think make The Witch a very compelling historical film. And sure, it's a horror movie, but it's not a cheap horror movie. There aren't many cheap jump scares, you know. It's not your traditional slasher film with a bunch of absolutely nonsensical violence and poor plots. It is something that is very much grounded in historical research, the lingo of the time, and, you know, as I said, all things considered, it doesn't require to be very much embellished as a result. And so I think this is a very timely, film to watch around Halloween time. And yet, at the same moment, it offers us all sorts of interesting considerations about 17th century colonial America. So, that wraps up this episode of Real History. We hope that this episode didn't haunt you or possess you too much. But, it's very good. It's a very good film, all things considered. And rest assured, we'll be taking a look at many more to come. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Real History. We'll see you next time.